Hello, everyone. Glad to be with you tonight. It's kind of an unusual thing for me to be standing in front of a slide that says sexy, but the idea that strong is the new sexy in this presentation is looking particularly at bone health and bone formation. And I'm happy to present to you tonight some very new information, some concepts and ideas that are grounded in science, but that your doctors or your experts may not quite agree with at this point. But it's sufficiently congruent, I guess you could say, that it's time to talk to women about it because it matters to us. So when we talk about bone health, we're talking about preventing fractures. And these can occur almost anywhere in our bodies, but it's a bit of a disaster to have a hip fracture. And it can be a very, very painful, long recovery, even to have what seems so inconsequential as a crushed vertebrae. Now, what we're going to talk about today is relevant for every phase of women's life cycle, for the growing of bone when we're young people, for the maintaining of bone across the menstruating years, for the perimenopause and menopause when there's inevitable bone loss, for healthy older ages, and to prevent, as long as we can, getting into the frail elder phase. So in this diagram, we're talking about things that are higher up being stronger, and we're talking about a concept that at some point we lose enough of our bone reserve that we're at high risk for fracture. But how does bone continue to maintain its strength? It does that by renewal. Now, we think of bone as being very hard, almost like a concrete or something, but it's not at all. It's very much a living tissue, and the secrets to maintaining healthy bone are in this remodeling balance. So I'm going to spend a few minutes and talk to you about that, because that's really important to understand. What it is a kind of renovation. It's upgrading, if you will. As things need fixing, it's fixing. And that process is a very standardized process that serves many purposes. Number one is bone strength, but number two is also, in the acute phase, providing adequate calcium. So I made this cartoon some years ago, and there's several parts to it. First of all of us and everywhere, I'm sure, are going through the road fixing up. And it doesn't take any time at all before the backhoes and the whatever have torn it all up. They've got it all blocked off, traffic is rerouted, whatever. And it seems to take forever till they're coming in and putting down the new foundation and putting down new asphalt, and finally it's done. What's important to realize is that the process of taking away what's old or damaged and putting in what's new are linked, but they don't follow the same time frame. And you'll see why that's important in a minute. So we can think of it in sort of fancier terms, that catabolic or breaking down is the resorption phase, tearing out the old bone, and we're still not quite sure why in any one spot in our skeleton that process begins. And the formation or anabolic or building phase is replacing that torn away bone with something new. Now here's the rub. Just like the street construction, taking away the old is very fast. Doesn't take any time at all. But laying down new bone is a very, very slow process. So though the two processes are linked, they're tipped toward bone loss. And that may be in particular important for humans, because some of the test animals, for example, rodents, rats, mice, they continue to grow almost all their lives. And so they don't have the same fast resorption that humans do. Okay, so this renovation process relates to 3 different types of cells. So let's start, and I'm going to say it that way every time because it's a stylized process. It has a similar pattern wherever it happens. Bone resorption begins in the bone marrow, and cells that are potentially red blood cells or white cells or platelets then turn into what are called pre-osteoclasts. And they eventually make these big multinucleated giant cells whose job it is to be the backhoe, if you will. So they're tearing away a bit of bone here. They're digging, literally digging a pit, and it's called a resorption pit. Now, it may only be 2/10 of a millimeter or 2 millimeters, very small amount. And then there's some kind of signaling that happens, and a different kind of cell, the osteoblast, which comes also from the bone marrow, but from a different sort of stem cell family, if you will, from the family that relates to muscle and tendon and fingernails and hair rather than blood cells. So the mesenchymal stem cell system, and actually the big trade-off is that it can either go toward a fat cell or toward a bone-making cell, bone or muscle or whatever making cell. And in fact, some of our drugs make it go toward a fat cell, which isn't good for bones. So these pre-osteoblasts then turn into mature osteoblasts. Now, if the osteoclast is big and has many nuclei, the osteoblast is small and tidy, only one nucleus, and it really is a lot more meticulous, slow-working, and its job is to lay down the protein matrix of bone, called osteoid, which then gets mineralized. Now you might say, those are the 2 cells of bone, right? How many were taught it in biology But there's a really important cell called an osteocyte that's buried in the mineralized bone. And these cells, you can sort of see it here, have tubular connections, canaliculi, like little canals, that connect both with the surface of the bone and with the cortex, the outer part of bone. So their job is to sense muscle movement, strain, workload of bone. And they play an important role in this remodeling cycle, though we don't really understand quite how it works yet. So here's an osteoclast. Now, you'll notice around it is a fuzzy area. That's because it's pulled in. They call them pseudopodia. It's legs that go out like that. But you can see on this surface of bone that it's chewed out an area. So here are osteoblasts along the surface here next to the bone marrow. This is the mineralized bone, and they're laying down this pinkish stuff that's called osteoid, or the protein of bone. And this is a very good way to see the osteocytes. Their cells are probably down here, some are probably up here, but they connect to each other to allow communication, especially of stress signals. So, adult bone renovation or renewal both maintains the strength and the mineral of bone, but also supplies calcium for emergencies. Now, ideally, these two processes of resorbing and forming would be balanced. They're connected, they're balanced ideally, but there are many, many things about ordinary life that imbalance them, and when they're imbalanced, it's toward too much bone loss. They have a typical pattern. It always goes from resorption to formation, that direction. And the rate that's normal changes across women's normal life cycle. So resorption, as we said before, is really very quick, and formation is really quite slow, which means that formation gets sort of ignored, left out, forgotten. That's what we're focusing on tonight, is bone formation and building strength in bone. So back to our life cycle of bone, and let's talk for a minute about young girls and adolescents. This is the time when we need to build toward the optimum we can be based on our genetics and our general health and everything about our previous history, including when we're in utero. That bone that we build then has to increase in size, it has to increase in the mineral content and the strength, and if you think about the size changes, they're just enormous. Well, the growth and the development of bones and skin and people in general in puberty is related to a whole host of hormones and things that are special when we're young, growth hormone and insulin and thyroid hormones. But the developing ovary and the developing hormones of the ovary and the adrenal are extremely important. So this young girl is probably fairly close to getting her first period. And that's around the time when the growth is maximal. They're growing tallest, fastest. And it's also around the time when estrogen levels are going up. But the sad part is estrogen is there in good quantity, and it's necessary, but it takes a while before progesterone, the other hormone, develops as well. So let's talk about now the life cycle of estrogen. Estrogens are very important bone hormone, and we'll come back to that in a minute. But let's think about it now in terms of our life cycle, in terms of reproduction. So in childhood, when we're infants, estrogen levels are very low. And just for a parallel, they're similar to the levels when we're in menopause. The estrogen levels rise very rapidly in puberty, and they often will do an overshoot. And then there are the menstruating years, long stretch, 20, 30 years of menstruation, when the average estrogen is a pretty high level. Who knows what happens here? I was taught that from that, then estrogen starts dropping. And the dropping in estrogen meant the beginning of menopause. But in reality, estrogen levels go much higher before they eventually become low. So they're highly, highly irregular for a while and do these big swings only about a year or maybe even 2 years after the last period do they settle down into the steady levels of menopause. But the life cycle of progesterone is quite different. Again, low in childhood, normally low in menopause. So we're not talking here about needing something that isn't natural here. But it takes a long while to build up progesterone production in the teen years. In fact, it takes about 12 years after the first period before progesterone production is to an adult normal level. The cycles have been regular in most women for a long time by then. And then here's the premenopausal ovulatory cycles, because progesterone isn't made unless you release an egg. And then early on in perimenopause, progesterone levels are too low. Certainly too low for the level of estrogen. Remember, estrogen goes high, and then it again goes high here. So there's an imbalance in the two hormone levels in both those times of our lives. Okay, so let's try to be practical about this remodeling idea. So let's say a healthy 16-year-old woman, she's going to school, and she starts the pill for cramps. Okay? So what's in the pill? Estrogen and a synthetic knockoff, if you will, of natural progesterone. And those two together, what are they going to do to bone? Well, we haven't known until fairly recently. But the big hormone is that the estrogen in an effective birth control pill is about 4 times higher than normal levels. So the result is suppression of both resorption and formation. But a 16-year-old is still growing, is still building bones and laying down minerals. So let's look at this diagram here. First, let me orient you. So we're looking at measurements at the total hip, at the spine, and the whole body. And you don't have to worry about the numbers here, but these are percent changes over 2 years. So at the total, okay, so then this bar here with the up and down stripes are young women, similar age, and all of the women in this diagram are 14 to 18 years old. So you can see that in the total hip, it doesn't seem to make a difference to use the pill as these two groups did. However, here's the lower dose pill, and that is a little lower in bone density, but not significantly. But the higher dose pill, greater than 30 micrograms or equal to or more than 30 micrograms, which used to be the standard pill. Now it's happily edging toward lower doses. These young women gain significantly less than those women who weren't treated with the pill. So the question is, why would we use the pill for cramps when it might have a negative effect on bone? The same is true with the higher dose for whole body bone density. So when you stop resorption at a time of when bone is still growing, you're going to prevent gaining the peak that we want. We have some data from Canada. The Canadian Multi-Center Osteoporosis Study is a random sample of, we started off with adults 25 to 80 plus across Canada. I run the Vancouver Center of the Canadian Multi-Center Osteoporosis Study. And then we realized that we didn't catch, by starting at age 25, we didn't catch peak bone mass, as already the 25-year-olds were losing bone, especially in the hip. That was true for men and women. So then we enrolled a youth cohort, and what I'm showing you here are the young women that were 16 to 19 years of age. What we're looking at is we ask them the question at baseline, at a questionnaire at year 1 and at year 2, if they were using birth control pills, and those who were are in this column of red dots here. And if they weren't, then they're here in this column. Now, we're looking at change over 2 years. So this line here would be no change in bone. Notice that the young women who are not on the pill are on average gaining bone. But those women who were on the pill were gaining less. Okay? So this says that not just in a selected sample of young women, the data I showed you before are from Group Health in Seattle, but women across Canada using the pill are losing bone, especially when they're teenagers. We're in the process of figuring out what the dose of estrogen was and making connections with other things in their lives. Okay, so that suggests that the estrogen in the pill is not doing good things. But I want you to understand that estrogen is extremely important for bone, not just for women, but also for men. So although we may find things that are disconcerting and negative, it doesn't mean that it's a blanket negative. I hope you understand. So now let's talk a bit about the normal menstrual cycle and how that relates to bone renovation. So the normal menstrual cycle, everybody knows, this is kind of a cartoon, but let's go through it anyway. So here's one period, and here's the next. That whole time is one cycle. And estrogen is actually quite low during flow. In fact, if you had it measured then, your doctor, if they didn't know you were having a period then, might, think you had a very low level. But that's normal during flow. It rises pretty rapidly to a peak that's about 250% above the baseline. There's a bit of a dip, and then it comes up again for a while, and then it falls again before the next flow. That's the normal estrogen pattern. The progesterone is quite different. It's low the full first half of the cycle, and then it rises, and I haven't drawn this accurately, but it rises about 1,400% above its baseline and is increased normally for at least 10 days and ideally closer to 14 or 16. So what we know now is that estrogen's job is to slow bone resorption. And because that's the dominant part of bone renovation, that's a really important job. But progesterone's job is to increase bone formation. This is the controversial part of what I'm showing you. But whenever anyone questions me about it, I say, well, what else works on women's bone formation? You tell me. Because we don't have evidence for anything else that plays this role. So progesterone sits on an osteoblast receptor that's very specific. In fact, osteoblast receptors for, well, this has been done in animals, it hasn't been tested in humans, but male animals don't have progesterone receptors on their osteoblasts. So it's a sex-specific stimulation of the osteoblasts. And what's interesting is that steroids or prednisone or glucocorticoids sit on that receptor if they can, if there's not enough progesterone. And when they sit there, the osteoblast basically curls up and goes away, doesn't do anything. When progesterone sits there, then the osteoblasts increase the osteoid and start building new bone. Parathyroid hormone, which is now used as a therapy and injection daily, also increases the osteoblastic bone formation, and testosterone does. They all have osteoblast receptors. So if you summarize what hormones do, let's think positively here. We want something that's going to slow excess resorption and stimulate needed formation. So estrogen does that decreasing resorption for women. Interestingly, it also does for men. And testosterone, to a certain degree, also does for men. But formation is progesterone for women and testosterone for men. Okay, so what's the evidence that progesterone is important for bone formation? What do we know? And the rest of the time, I'll be talking about the evidence and walking you through it. And then we're going to see a video clip that's rather quick and has a lot of information in it. And then we'll summarize and we'll have time for some questions. So during those 30 to 40 years of menstruating life, bone should be maintaining itself, staying at about the same level. In other words, during that young, healthy time period, the resorption and formation should be balanced. Well, I learned something because in the early days, like late 70s, early 80s, the message that all the young women who wanted to run and train for marathons and things were getting was, it's going to be bad for your menstrual cycle, you're going to get amenorrhea, and your period's going to go away. So, and it's also going to be bad for your bones. So I said, wait a minute, women have been doing exercise, pretty strenuous stuff for eons. They've had to. For example, the Kong woman of the Kalahari walked 20K a day, carrying usually their youngest. Any kids that are less than 5, they're usually carrying. They do that even when they're pregnant. And then they grub and dig for roots and beetles and bugs and the essential food that they need. So I set out and I said, well, we're going to enroll women who are perfectly healthy and normal at the beginning, normal weight, regular cycles, and we proved that they were ovulating 2 cycles in a row. And then, but they had different exercise habits, and we simply followed them over 1 full year and observed what happened. Well, when I initially applied, I couldn't get funding because cycle changes aren't very interesting. So I said, well, maybe if they run too much during that year, they're going to lose bone. So I linked it to bone, and then we got funding. So here's what happened across these. This is no change again. We're looking at change in bone in 4 different groups of women, divided by what their menstrual cycle experiences were the whole year. So 13 of those women had perfectly normal ovulatory cycles the whole year. Another 12 had 1 cycle in which they ovulated, but there was too short a time of progesterone. A whole bunch, 28, had more than 1 short luteal phase, and 13 had 1 cycle where they didn't make an egg or any progesterone. Plus, these women also had short luteal phases. So what it shows is that having more than 1 short luteal phase or any anovulatory cycles are related to a huge amount of bone loss. This loss is major, and it's in the honeycomb kind of bone that's in our spine, for example. But how can that be? The women kept regular cycles. Even the 19 women that trained for and ran a marathon during that year had regular menstrual cycles. What does a regular, normal-like cycle mean? It means enough estrogen. So how could they be losing bone? Well, I set out to try to figure that out. So remember the diagram of the menstrual cycle, that estrogen rises to a peak, drops a bit, and then drops down to the next flow? Well, a dropping estrogen level triggers bone resorption. That's the key. When it's high or steady, there's not going to be increased resorption. But as soon as it drops, then there's increased bone loss. So if a regularly cycling, normal weight, but stressed young woman has a wrist fracture, and we ask why, on average, she will have been losing 2.6 or between 2 and 3% of her spinal bone each year. Or this would be over 3 years. Because the normal menstrual cycles up and down of estrogen cause a little bit of increased bone resorption that you need to ovulate in order and to have enough progesterone to stimulate new bone formation to counterbalance that. Does that make sense? It took me quite some time to figure that out. So she's stressed, she's not ovulating, and has lower than normal progesterone, is not making enough bone formation to balance this little bit of increased bone loss that occurs because of the normal cycle. Here's what we now know. This was a study published last year, which is called a meta-analysis. It puts together studies from many different studies and makes a strong statement out of them together. So the study I just showed you about the 66 women is here, and we found 6 or 5 other studies in the literature that had measured both changes in bone and how women were ovulating or not. So here, let me orient you. This 0 line means no change in bone. What we've done is to say better ovulation here on this side and worse ovulation on this side. So I think you can see that those women in each group of women that were studied in each cohort who were having worse ovulation were losing bone. So the average in this triangle here that they were losing was 0.86% a year, almost 0.9 or 1% a year. Again, most of these women were regularly cycling. They had cycles. No one would say, oh, that's abnormal. You know, it just doesn't register if the cycle is normal. So one of the reasons that women don't ovulate, it can be related to many things, but stress is the most common reason. It can be physical stress because of overwork or overexercise or illness, but most commonly it's emotional, psychological, social stress, bullying, abuse, that kind of thing. Through messages in the brain, signals go to the ovary and signals go to the bone, and there's a kind of a back and forth coordination with nutritional deficiency, in part because when we're emotionally upset, we don't eat well. It's the other thing that often goes is don't sleep well. And all of these are connected there. The brain says, uh-oh, this woman is not eating enough, she's not sleeping well, she's worried, she's upset. We don't want her getting pregnant right now. So the simplest adaptive response to that is to say, well, we'll let her ovulate, but not quite make enough progesterone to get pregnant. And if the stress is more, then not ovulate at all. But still enough estrogen, just not enough progesterone. So the stresses that we have can be many. And I think one of the things every young woman's toolkit needs to include is how to relax, do meditation, yoga breathing, or something that helps calm and reassure and ground us. Okay, so we're talking now about menstrual cycles and what can go funny with them. What we've just said is you can have a perfectly regular normal length cycle. The normal length, by the way, is 21 to 35 days. By the way, when I entered medical school, the Student Health Services gave this questionnaire, do you have regular cycles? I said yes. They didn't ask me how far apart they were. I think mine were 36 to 42 days at the time. Any rate, but perfectly normal length and regular cycles can have a normal amount of progesterone here in turquoise, a short luteal phase, less than 10 days of progesterone, or not be ovulatory at all. What we're working on is trying to figure out ways that women can know whether or not they're ovulating cycle by cycle, because that's what matters. Or you can have a long cycle, as I did when I was in medical school, which can or doesn't, often is not ovulatory, or you can totally skip periods, as I did when I first went away to university, called amenorrhea. Now, which of these cycle types is normal? Only this one. So, we need to know what to do when someone has an abnormal cycle. This is not a situation in a young woman who's menstruating regularly. You don't want to be giving Fosamax or one of the big gun bone drugs. But what if we gave back progesterone that they're missing? What would happen? 14 days of progesterone. Now, thankfully, we have the natural hormone that's the same as what our ovaries make. What if we did that? Well, I did a study years ago, before we actually had the bioidentical progesterone, with a cousin of, or a synthetic knockoff of progesterone called medroxyprogesterone. It happens it sits on the same progesterone receptor on the osteoblast that we talked about. And so I said, well, what if we gave it to a group of women? All of them have abnormal cycles. Either they didn't get their period, or they got their period, months apart, or they got regular cycles, but they weren't ovulating, or they had regular cycles, but they had short luteal phases all the time. So they were stratified into 4 different groups and 2 therapies. I know it's a bit complicated. Again, we've got the line here of no change. So the 4 groups are these. Group A got medroxyprogesterone for 10 days. I was using the minimal rather than the optimal amount each cycle, each month, if they didn't get their period, plus an additional gram of calcium a day. Now, all of these women had a good, healthy diet. They were all getting about 1,000 milligrams a day of calcium. They were normal weight. They weren't smokers. But they had funny periods, probably that stress thing. So this group got the progestin and calcium. This group got the progestin but without the calcium. This group got only the active calcium. And this group got both placebos. And what we found was a gain in bone, especially in this group, about a 3% gain in bone in 1 year. This is spine bone by DEXA. There was bigger scatter in the group that didn't get the extra calcium. I think the extra calcium was slowing bone resorption, as we know it does. Here, the calcium seemed to prevent significant loss, but those women who got both placebos were losing a highly important amount of bone. So basically, it's saying that it's proving that progestin or progesterone sitting on the osteoblast receptor can stimulate bone formation, because this is a real gain in bone. And we know that progesterone and medroxyprogesterone do not slow bone resorption. So it has to be working on formation. Okay, so we've been talking about adolescents and young women. What about perimenopause? Remember, this is the time when estrogen is doing its really big swings. That's a time when bone loss occurs, and it's normal. I can remember being pretty aggravated in perimenopause myself, because I was doing everything right. I was exercising, taking my D, taking my calcium, eating healthily, all that stuff. And I lost 5% of my hip bone density in 2 years. I thought, my goodness, what about somebody who's not doing everything right? What are they going to lose? So what we know now, well, let me have you look at this a second. This is a snapshot from inside of the cancellous or trabecular bone in a hip, actually, but it's a similar kind of bone in our spines and other parts of our body. This is abnormal. How old do you think this woman is? Guesses? Well, you can see that she's at risk for fracture. These struts that give bone strength are starting to break. Here's another thin one here. She was 47. Now, only thing I know about her is her age, and it was listed in the diagram. I took it from a medical journal as 47. I'll show you another one later. Okay, now we're back to CAMUS data. Here we're looking at women, all the women in the 25 to 80 plus group, looking at the rate of change. Here we have no change again. Those that when the line is above means they're gaining bone. Some were in their teen years. And we're looking here at the total hip bone density. Along about 45, 49, there's bone loss here. The women that were clearly in perimenopause, not yet menopausal, not menstruating normally, look at how rapidly they're losing bone, more so than the women who were menopausal. So our concept has been menopause causes estrogen deficiency, causes bone loss. But that's clearly not correct. Perimenopause with swinging estrogens causes bone loss, and the most rapid bone loss of all. So this bone loss, from the time that cycles become irregular until about 3 to 4 years after the last period, is, I think, kind of inevitable. It's an adaptive process. It's part of the life cycle, which makes it even more important to gain high peak bone mass. We don't yet know anything that actually slows that bone loss. Now, here's a normal look inside of cancellous bone. How old is this woman? Well, I'm going to ask you, this is going to be surprising, but she's 75 and she died in a car accident. So having weak bones is less about age than it is about building it, keeping it through the premenopausal years. So if we look again here after the quick losses, remember that menopause begins at different ages, and when you look at a whole population, that's why these lines overlap here. But these are women who are at least a year beyond their last flow. You can see that they're losing some bone, but not a lot. Okay? And then later, bone loss begins again. And that we want to prevent as long as we can, to get that more rapid bone loss out farther and farther in older ages. So a bit of a review. Remember that bone renovation influences both how strong our bones is right now and our risk for fracture. So a healthy 16-year-old using the pill for something she doesn't really need it for, we can treat cramps with ibuprofen, is not going to have the normal bone gain that we want her to. Or a regularly cycling woman who's normal weight but very stressed may be at risk for fracture because she's not ovulating. A 45-year-old woman with irregular cycles, waking at 3 a.m. with night sweats, is going to be losing bone, and probably quite rapidly. But a 65-year-old woman who walks everywhere, eats well, and has had no broken bones may not be losing rapidly. This kind of a view changes our concepts about who's vulnerable. So, osteoporosis means that this remodeling balance is abnormal, and fractures are a risk. So now, let's go to, except I can't see the icons here. I can shut it down for a second. Oh, no. I put a slide in here as the gap before we show the video. Almost see. Strange. Let's end the show. We can go back to it. Okay? Yeah. Just now minimize, yeah. So this is a video clip that we made recently. Can't we make it bigger? Yeah.
Our mission at the Center for Menstrual Cycle and Ovulation Research is to create and share a scientific, holistic body of knowledge focused on normal patterns of hormones in the population and changes in women's menstrual cycles and ovulatory characteristics across the life cycle.
It's a very unusual center because it's mostly virtual. We have a few staff here, we're doing some ongoing research, but a lot of what we do is making available information online through the SEMCOR website. And it's the only research center in the world, as far as I know, that's focused on not only menstrual cycles, but ovulation.
We're really excited about the relaunch and redesign of our SEMCOR website. We have between 3,000 and 4,500 page views per day and 90,000 visitors per month from 187 different countries. So we're excited and pumped that we are reaching our target audience and that women from all age groups all across the world are finding the information that they need about menstrual cycles and ovulation.
We were doing an observational study in a group of 66 healthy women. We started out with women that had perfectly normal menstrual cycles. They had to have normal cycle length, but they also had to ovulate and make progesterone in a normal amount. And then we simply observed them over time and measured bone density at the beginning and the end. What we found was that some of these women, for unexplained reasons, were losing a lot of bone. Given that estrogen is so important for women's bone health, that was mysterious. And then we realized that what was different about those who were losing bone is that they were making progesterone but not enough, or they were making none at all a few cycles during that year.
The normal menstrual cycle, like bone remodeling, has two phases. The initial phase is the follicular phase. And that's where we have increasing levels of estrogen during that time. In the luteal phase, you have an increase in progesterone. And the first half of the menstrual cycle, you have a prevention of bone loss. In the second half of the menstrual cycle, when you have an increase in progesterone, that's when we see bone formation. And this is a cyclical event, just like bone remodeling, that's regulated by both bone resorption and bone formation.
We have found 6 original papers that have documented these results in more than 400 samples and in more than 3 countries in 3 continents that have confirmed the original data. So those 6 studies included more than 400 women who are healthy and have regular menstrual cycles, but they do commonly have ovulatory disturbances, and in those women with more frequent ovulatory disturbances, they have a significant tendency towards bone loss of approximately 1% per year.
Between 1995 and 1997, we randomly recruited 9,423 men and women in 9 centers in 7 provinces, and one of the centers in Vancouver, a coordinating center, is in Montreal. We also recruited between 2005 and 2007 young cohort, ages 16 to 24, 1,001 men and women. Recently, our center took the lead to compare bone changes between users and non-users of combined hormonal contraceptives in teen and young women ages 16 to 24. To our knowledge, there is no population-based data of CHC or combined hormonal contraceptives and bone changes in young women. So our preliminary data in 323 women with 2-year bone change confirmed previous studies that showing that CHC or combined hormonal contraceptives prevent teenagers to achieve their optimal bone mass, peak bone mass, meaning that those taking the pills are gaining less bone than those not taking the pills. And according to our 2-year data, 76% of participants used the pill.
It is unclear why the teenagers in the CAMO study failed to gain as much bone as those teenagers who weren't on the pill.
We discovered that mysterious finding that some healthy women with regular normal length cycles were losing bone. And when we realized that the difference between those losing and not losing was their exposure to progesterone, their menstrual cycle ovulation characteristics, then we said, what if we gave back progestin, well, in that case, progestin, something that acts like progesterone through the bone formation system? What would happen if we gave that to women whose cycles were abnormal? We gave sort of a luteal phase or a progesterone phase of the cycle replacement, 10 days a month of this progestin, to a group of women that were otherwise healthy but had abnormal cycles. And we found a remarkable gain in bone, 2 to 3% gain in those who got the cyclic progestin versus a 2% loss in those who got the placebo. And calcium helped, so there was about a 1% greater gain on the progestin when extra calcium was on board, and the calcium alone prevented bone loss.
The basic answer is yes, progesterone is important for building bone in women. The evidence comes from small randomized control trials showing that progesterone alone is an effective agent to promote bone gain in women. There's also a recent meta-analysis that we've done that will be published soon that shows that estrogen plus progesterone has a 0.5% greater bone gain than estrogen alone. And so there remains a lot more work to be done. These are new findings, but progesterone is a very safe agent to use in women. And the early evidence suggests that there's a clear effect on bone gain when using this agent.
The most important things that I've learned in my career and research is that progesterone is women's bone-forming hormone. We learned early that women could have regular menstrual cycles and be losing bone, and discovered that it was because they had less progesterone than normal. They had ovulatory disturbances that were silent And we also have learned that we can treat with cyclic progesterone for half of the cycle and rebuild that bone so that they will not have fractures later.
Oh.
Oops.
I am feeling so,
Sorry. Getting a little extra YouTube here. So let's summarize here, and then we'll have some time for some discussion and questions. A number of years ago, I put together sort of an alphabet to remind and say in a simple way what things are important for women's bone. A for active, B for brawny, and brawny Schwarzenegger isn't exactly the way that women want to be, but being strong is important. Having strong bone and strong muscles is really important, and the two do go together. Having adequate amount of calcium, and I think for those who have abnormal cycles or who have bone health risks, the calcium that's necessary may be higher than some of the recommended for the average person. Vitamin D, we all know about. This was a new one, E for easygoing. We now understand that the stress system, be it the adrenocortical stress system with high cortisone or the equivalent of prednisone, is very, very negative for bones, but so is excess sympathetic hormones, epinephrine, the things that make you feel like butterflies and shaky and all that stuff. Cold hands is another one. Sign of it. So learning how to deal with the stressors of our lives, acknowledging them, facing them, and dealing with them straight on. And F for formation. So that could be normal fertility, normal ovulation in the younger years, but we mustn't ignore that whenever we give a bone building or a bone, actually it's a wrong concept, but whenever we give an osteoporosis medicine, remember, resorption, formation are linked. When we suppress resorption, which is what most of the drugs do, the bisphosphonates and denosumab, calcitonin, all of them suppress resorption. What do they do to formation? They suppress it because they're linked. So we shouldn't forget that. And there are many circumstances, when giving progesterone to women who have a need for osteoporosis treatment, should be given with progesterone to stimulate bone formation. And then good habits, not smoking, not too much colas and those kinds of things, eating well, vegetables and fruits and nutrient-dense food in the CAMA study in menopausal women was associated with fewer fractures. We actually divided by their diet histories women into those who ate a Western kind of diet that was energy dense, and those who ate what we would call a prudent diet that had vegetables and fruit and whole grains and dairy products and things. And those who had the nutrient-dense diet had fewer fractures. So don't ever discount good habits. So in summary, bone renovation is different and normally different across the life cycle. How we live our lives, and the hormone levels of each of our phases of our life cycle are important to bone remodeling. Estrogen prevents bone loss. It's actually an indirect effect. It doesn't have a direct effect on the osteoclasts, but progesterone directly stimulates new bone formation. Progesterone therapy for 14 days in a cycle increases bone density in women with abnormal cycles because of stress or not sleeping or eating enough. And throughout life, exercise, diet, vitamin D and calcium, as well as being happy and feeling useful in your community, are essential to bone health. So I am happy to answer questions and interested in your reaction. Are we going to record this? Do you know, Bonnie? If then you would go up to just 2 rows behind you, there's a mic and you just push the button. Thank you. I would have been heartbroken if nobody asked a question. Okay? A little louder. Is the red light on?
Oh, yes. All right. My question, you said that you checked the young teens for their ovulation. Is that a difficult test? Is that something a regular doctor would do? How would it, I mean, we consider a regular period to be every,
That's right.
They have a show. Okay. But how do you know what's going on is okay?
Okay, good question. Basically, in order to know that a cycle is ovulatory, you need to have some kind of a measure of progesterone. Progesterone can be measured in the blood, it can be measured in saliva or in urine. Those are the standard ways. Now, there's a complicated way, which is to do an ultrasound of the ovary and watch the follicle get bigger and bigger, and then it decreases in size, which means it popped or the egg was released. That's a complicated and expensive way to do it. But those are the reliable ways to assess whether or not the cycle's ovulatory. We definitely need a way to do that that's easy and inexpensive.
Yeah, because doctors aren't doing that, so years and years.
I wouldn't recommend it all the time, but in fact, most of the time women will know if that I'm too stressed, I'm not getting enough sleep, I think if you learn to read your body and you learn to deal with the environment you live in, you will pick up in most cases. So maybe doing a blood test for progesterone about day 20 or so of the menstrual cycle would be enough. But there's also a way that's very inexpensive, which is to take your first morning temperature. And what we did, progesterone raises the core temperature by a small amount, but a reliable amount. So if you take your temperature every morning and you write it down we have a diary on the SEMCOR website, there's the address there, which you can download and do for free. The instructions are there. Basically, you look at all those numbers, and you add them up and divide by the number of cycles, days in that cycle, so you get an average. Then you can look and say, well, if the average is 36.8, where does it go above that average and stay above? And that's basically when progesterone is there. So it's possible to do, it's not easy to do at the moment. Good question.
The other thing you said was that you had a bone density when you went into nursing, or you were around 40. You had a bone density done, and you were surprised you were losing. But the age that you said you had it isn't the normal age. A doctor will say, sure, why don't you have a bone density?
The only reason I had it was because I was in a study. So, turn the mic off, but I'm hoping other people will go there. I showed in the video this diagram, which is worth going over maybe. It's a similar meta-analysis. So here is the no change in bone. On this side, we have the change in bone in menopausal women who were randomized to take estrogen alone. And each of these studies here, seems like 6 is the magic number. Again, 6 studies. Each of these studies directly randomized women to estrogen alone or estrogen with progestin. And what you can see if you look is that here's the estrogen progestin side, that in almost every case there was more gain in bone in those women who were on estrogen with progestin. And in most cases, it's a very low dose, 2.5 milligrams. In the study I showed you of the young women, it was 10 milligrams, which is closer to a normal dose. So this is estrogen with 0.5 milligrams of Provera or medroxyprogesterone, caused a 0.5% greater gain each year. Because progestin doesn't work on bone resorption, and because estrogen's there at the same time, we can infer that that's bone formation related increased bone density. And I think if natural progesterone were used in a more normal dose, that we would see a much bigger gain in the combined therapy group. The difficulty is that I haven't been able to get funding to do these kinds of studies. And it would take a lot of funding to do the right study, which is a fracture prevention trial. But rather than be discouraged about not having the funding, I think the data are sufficient now to start thinking about it as a reasonable therapy. There are other questions? Yeah. Behind. Just go to the mic. Thank you.
Hi, can you hear me? So just a couple of questions. Have you ever looked at the difference between women who've had children and who haven't had children, and whether there's any difference in bone density?
Okay, good question. Those women who've never been pregnant versus those women who have been. In the old days, I think there would have been. Now it's a choice to have children or not. So in the old days, when we didn't have effective contraception, the most common reason for not having children was not being able to, and the most common reason would be not ovulating. Today, I don't think there's much difference.
And also, if someone's on the progestin, can they get pregnant? Like if you are taking the...
Okay. So, cyclic progesterone is the opposite of birth control. In fact, it's more like, you're more likely to get pregnant if you're taking it. So, anyone who's using that as a therapy needs to use barrier methods.
Thank you.
Good questions, very practical. At the mic. Okay. Okay. Is your mic on? Is there a red dot? There's a button to push.
Oh.
Now ask again.
Okay. The use of hormones has been, in HRT, has been linked to cancer. So what are the risks of giving hormones for this purpose?
Okay, good question. So we know that estrogen alone or estrogen with synthetic knockoffs of progesterone increase the risk of breast cancer. Okay? But we also know that progesterone prevents endometrial cancer that estrogen alone causes. That's why we don't do those studies where we give just estrogen alone anymore unless a woman has had their uterus removed. Okay? As far as I know, and the evidence says that progesterone does not increase cancer risk. In fact, it counterbalances the risks that are related to estrogen. That's true in the endometrium for sure, and a big observational study, more than 80,000 women in France, says it's true about breast cancer also. So there isn't an added risk by taking progesterone.
Your conference is scheduled to end in 2 minutes.
Jeez.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
The other thing is that progesterone, as far as we know, is safe in terms of heart health. In fact, I wrote a paper last year that put all the evidence together and says, we normally think about young women as being protected against heart disease, and women in general as starting to get heart disease about 10 years later than men do. But in order to have that protection, we need not just estrogen, we also need progesterone. We need ovulatory cycles. So and we did a proper randomized controlled trial, short term, 3 months, and looked at all of the cardiovascular risk factors when we just gave menopausal women progesterone. So there were no changes in weight, no changes in blood pressure, no changes in waist circumference, no changes in cholesterol, no changes in blood sugar. Basically, what we've learned now is that both estrogen and progesterone work on the blood vessels to increase flow. So progesterone has that as a positive action for the heart system and no negatives. So I think as my colleague in the film said, it's a very, very safe medicine. And it has a lovely side effect, which is that it helps sleep. That's the reason that the natural progesterone needs to be taken.
Your conference is now over. Goodbye.
We can keep on talking.